I'm Michael Max, and this is Qiological. This is one of a number of special podcasts from the Shenlong Society's day-long conference on Chinese herbal medicine. Our first conversation here is with Kevin Ergol. We're taking a look at some regulations behind herbal medicine that you may not know about, but it would be good to be informed about. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. All the sponsors here provide helpful products or services that you'll find beneficial in your clinical work. Want to get better at treating concussions and other neurological conditions? Clayton Shu has some innovative methods. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. Later in the show, Jane offers you helpful suggestions on how to raise your rates, and Golden Flower Chinese Herbs shares a journey of healing that I think you'll recognize. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Qiological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more. Ever found yourself listening to a Qiological conversation and thinking, wow, I needed to hear that? Yeah, me too. And I never know when I'm going to hear a guest say something that stops my world and reboots it with a larger perspective. If these conversations have ever helped you to feel more grounded, more inspired, or just less alone in this strange and wonderful work we do, consider becoming a member or supporting the podcast with a bit of tithing to the donation jar. It helps keep the lights on here at the Qiological Sound and Motion Lab so that we can bring you these conversations every Tuesday morning. You'll find all the details at qiological.com. Thanks for listening and for being a part of this.
Hey there, I'm Cameron Jafari, an acupuncturist from Los Angeles. So I started learning nanopuncture from Dr. Clayton Shu because I was facing these complex neurological conditions like stroke and MS in my clinic, and I just felt like I lacked a solid process to treat them. Brain-related issues always felt like a whole different animal, and I was looking for a clinical system that worked and could guide me through them. So after attending my first nanopuncture seminar, I was able to apply the process pretty quickly and with pretty amazing results. I remember the first stroke patient I saw afterwards was a guy who had had a stroke 2 years back, and he couldn't talk at all. And after a few treatments, he started saying a few words. And a few treatments after that, he could actually have conversations. It was pretty incredible. So this is why I feel like nanopuncture is the future of acupuncture neurology. And you can be a part of that. Their next seminar is on treating concussions and is being co-taught by both Dr. Shu and Dr. Ayla Wolf in New York City on April 26th and 27th. To learn more, visit nanopunctureseminars.com.
Hey friends, I've got Kevin Ergol with me. Kevin is one of the speakers here at the Shenlong Society conference, and we are taking a little time to go more deeply into some things that all y'alls that do herbs, whether you're bagging them up or compounding them out of granules or whatever, you probably need to know about. There is some background stuff here that most of us don't consider when it comes to the laws of this country, and also future possibilities that we need to be paying attention to. And Kevin has some great information for us about that. So we're going to have a conversation here about things in the background legally that we should know about. Kevin, welcome to Qiological.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be here.
Good to have you. So, we had a little conversation previous to this one, and there are some laws that you started telling me about, and it totally took me by surprise. I've been doing this for 20 years, and there's some things in the background here that I never really knew about, but you've got some information on. Could you just give us a brief overview to start with on what this stuff is?
Well, let's look at this a minute. I think what I'm going to do, if it's all right with you, is sort of start off with the law that's kind of the most critical piece of regulation, and then maybe back up a little bit and put it in context. The the act that we were talking about the other day is the Dietary Supplements Health and Education Act that was passed in 1994, and I think to some extent practitioners may be faintly aware of this. It At the time, it was a piece of legislation that essentially prevented the FDA from independently taking action against herbs and other natural products by treating them all as if they were drugs. And so the act did some very specific things. It created a category of products called dietary supplements, which we're all kind of familiar with because now here we are, um, 2019. So literally 20, close to 25 years later, we all kind of talk about dietary supplements,
And
and
it's a huge business.
it's an enormous business. And frankly, that's why we got this law in the first place. Um, Tom Harkin and Orrin Hatch, both representing states with a significant dietary supplement producing companies, vitamins, herbs, natural health, were successful in getting this legislation passed. And it was actually great legislation. FDA, as I think everybody's sort of generally aware, came into being around 1906 and came into existence, to protect the public. We had lots of issues with adulterated, unsafe drugs. We had lots of issues with food quality. There were lots of unethical activities that were not illegal, drugs containing dangerous things that people weren't being told about. And FDA was a successful project. It grew up in 1938, I believe. It expanded its scope. And again, people may or may not be aware, FDA is charged with keeping a close eye on food safety, drug products, also oversees medical devices, cosmetics. And with the Act of 1994, dietary supplements moved into a specific place in FDA's regulatory process. And the clue is that word, that there's two words, dietary supplement. Because what FDA was told was if people sell a product that you can consume by mouth that's safe based on the available information and beneficial to health or necessary or desired in a human diet, you can't act against this product using drug rules. You've got to act against it or regulate it using these new rules for dietary supplements. The key aspect of that was that dietary supplements were moved directly under food regulation.
Where had they been prior to that?
In the middle of nowhere. This was the thing. They were a constantly contested product. Um, they had sort of an ambiguous status, and FDA was looking at a whole range of things and essentially making it very clear to the industry that they were uncomfortable with many of the products being sold and many of the claims. So if you look at what the act did, it's an interesting thing. It created this term, dietary supplement, and it said it can be used to supplement the diet. And it can include vitamins, minerals, herbs, other botanicals, amino acids, enzymes, organ tissues, glandular products, metabolites, and it can be extracts or concentrates. And this was a great piece of legislation for our community. Although one of the problems is we still, as a whole, generally, don't really understand what it might or might not mean. Because we practice Chinese medicine, Chinese herbal medicine, whatever you'd like to call it, and we diagnose and treat disease. I mean, in some instances, we carefully describe our activities to avoid issues around that. But at the end of the day, that's really what we do. I mean, we represent a 2,500-year-old tradition of diagnosing and treating disease using these tools. So one of the first things we ran into was the problem with the ephedra, which probably most listeners are aware that after quite a bit of controversy and after the diet supplement industry marketed quite a few products containing ephedra and caffeine, there were problems with, as well there should be. Although I'll tell you from a sort of ancillary point of view, the diet products, as long as you use them appropriately, were what they claim to be. The real problem was with the so-called energy boosters, the training fuels, and these entirely illegal products that were sold as alternatives to street drugs, things like herbal ecstasy, for instance. And one of the things we saw, and I guess I should comment on, is FDA did not like the Dietary Supplements Health and Education Act very much, which I'm going to call DSHEA from now on, because that's the short form. And FDA's response to DSHEA was to claim that it was unable to regulate.
So let me make sure I've got this straight. On one hand, we've got DSHEA, and it's taken what we do from the middle of nowhere, completely unregulated. It's put it under some form of regulation. We're calling it dietary supplements. And it's under the auspices of the FDA now in that through that particular category, through that particular means that they have of paying attention to these things. Okay. We're not a drug, I mean, we're not regulated in that way, but there's some oversight. And the FDA gets involved through the oversight that they have permission to do so via DSHEA.
That's correct. And you made a very important point. And I think maybe this is a good time to talk about this sort of second aspect of this, because our community sort of collectively heaved a sigh of relief in 1994 and said, okay, we're safe. Let's see, I want to get the year right. When the regulations were finally published by FDA, which occurred in about 2006, close to 12 years after they had been requested. The proposed rule, actually, came out in 2003, about 7 years after, or 9 years after it should have been done.
What took them so long?
Well, this really, there's a lot of history in here, and I can mention two herbs that are a big part of this history. One of them was ephedra, and the other one was the substitution of guanfangji for fangji and the aristolochic acid contamination. And both of those stories indicate sort of what FDA's strategy was, because from 1994 to about 2006, or rather 2003, FDA essentially said, we're not being allowed to regulate these potentially dangerous products. And so I mentioned herbal ecstasy, which was a street drug substitute containing mahuang. That was illegal under every relevant federal and, in many cases, state laws, because it's not legal to sell something that is a illegal drug substitute. DEA, for instance, has very clear rules about this. FDA simply refused to act, claiming that its hands were tied. And in the end, it actually took congressional action to get FDA to move against ephedra.
Now, why would they not want to move against it?
Well, our opinion, because I'm sure that I probably would receive vehement disagreement from the FDA, and I respect the agency. I think this agency does useful things. That's over the years was that FDA wished that DSHEA would be changed, would be amended, and would return to it the kind of regulatory authority that it had before the act passed. Because before the act passed, FDA had targeted other herbs and had it wound up in court fights, but it also had the ability to take, kind of unilateral action under its regulatory authority. So
even though at that time these things weren't really regulated.
Well, they not really regulated is a tricky expression. They were under FDA's authority, and FDA tended to look at them as drugs.
If they decided it was a drug-like substance, they could target it.
Going back to your statement, they're not drugs. They're not drugs in regulation, dietary supplements. But remember, I mentioned we're using these substances to treat disease. As soon as someone makes what's called a drug claim, like if you go to the supermarket and you browse the supplement section and you see something called sleep better, on the back it'll have a compliant label. Maybe it'll have Swanzao Ren, or maybe it'll have valerian, or maybe it'll have all those two and melatonin. And it'll say promotes restful night's sleep. That's what we call a structure function claim. That pertains to the normal function of the human body and normal physiology. If it's
so you can claim that, but you can't claim this will cure your insomnia.
Exactly. That's exactly correct. That then constitutes a drug claim. So we now live in an interesting environment, and we've had some benefits over the years. Well, let me before I apologize. Before I go on, so that was ephedra kind of was left until a crisis emerged, and in the end, FDA was forced to act. Similarly, the substitution of guanfangji for hanfangji, the aristolochia for the stephania, that emerged as a significant object of concern internationally, and to a lesser extent with the U.S. And FDA delayed action, even though it had full regulatory authority, until its former director, I believe it was David Kessler, actually publicly shamed them into an action of enforcement. And that was when they made the import bans and required that there be assessment for the presence of aristolochic acid. So historically, FDA really had a reluctance to actualize DSHEA. They finally did that in 2003. They put out their initial rule for what are called current good manufacturing practices. And that's where things got very, very interesting for our profession. Because those rules, at the intro, you talked about whether you're compounding granules or bagging up herbs. Under the current good manufacturing practices and the definitions and rules that the FDA published in 2003, if I step into my dispensary and pull two herbs from two separate bottles and drop them together in a plastic bag, I have manufactured. And that is the law, the regulation. So this began to really perturb people and raise concerns. The industry, by which I mean both the product industry and our professional community, responded to the regulations, communicated extensively with FDA around these. And I want to loop back to good manufacturing practice because there's a lot of value in there. But I will tell you what happened in 2009. in its response to public commentary and in its clarification of the regulations that it was putting forth under DSHEA for manufacturing, FDA declared that it was going to utilize what is termed enforcement discretion. And enforcement discretion in this case meant that individuals such as naturopaths, Chinese herbal medicine practitioners, acupuncturists with training in herbal medicine, herbalists were exempt from the manufacturing standards as long as they had adequate training in the professional practice and that they were manufacturing, remember that can just be 2 herbs in a bag, for an individual client with whom they had a practitioner relationship. So that was very, very good news for our community.
Yeah, that's because otherwise we have to have clean rooms and all kinds of stuff, right?
Well, that's subject to interpretation, but it's not, it's actually the clean room might or might not have been a requirement. The issue basically was product tracking and sample retention.
Mm.
Because, I don't want to exaggerate, but I'll say, for example, if I took those 2 herbs and put them in a bag, I would need to have not just precise documentation of where those 2 herbs came from, but I would actually be smart to keep samples of those 2 herbs.
Oh, my goodness.
Because most manufacturers will have reference samples and materials associated with each product batch that they manufacture.
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that I use to keep my practice running smoothly. So, let's talk about something that can be a little bit uncomfortable, raising your fees. I know, this is something that might feel awkward, but it doesn't have to. With a bit of planning and care, you can handle it in a way that feels right for you and your patients. One tip, give yourself at least 2 months to prepare. This gives you time to get comfortable with the change and let your patients know what's happening. You can share the news through emails, booking reminders, or even just a friendly little sign in your clinic, and avoid over-apologizing. Instead, keep it straightforward and matter of fact. Keeping things consistent across the ways that you communicate can really help avoid confusion. Fee increases aren't always easy, but you're not on your own here. For more tips and ideas on how to communicate these changes with confidence, check out frontdesk.chain.app and look for the article, How to Tell Your Clients You're Raising Your Fees. Oh, and one last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, use the code CHEOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. But since we're doing it on a 1-by-1, sort of custom made for our patients, we don't need to do this.
That's correct. And at the same time, and I don't know when you'd like to move on. If you think we've done DSHEA well, we could sort of talk about the issues because what I would say is this: we don't have a legal obligation to do any of that, but very likely we have some professional and possibly some ethical obligations to do the things that we can do sensibly to protect our patients when we do supply them with natural products out of our offices.
I would love to get more into that in a few minutes, but let's finish up with DSHEA.
Absolutely. So I think there are 2 things that I would really like to share with the listeners and folks today about DSHEA, because whenever a problem kind of apparently goes away, then we all sort of heave a sigh of relief and go on about our business.
It's human nature.
Yeah, that bless our hearts, right? 1994, when DSHEA passed, huge sigh of relief from the supplement community, including us, right? And when we saw Mahuang go away, I think that was concerning to a lot of people. There were big fights. In the end, we lost the battle in certain ways. The other thing is that Deshay put us in a category that at the end of the day is not accurate for what we do. And that inaccuracy comes back to bite us from time to time. At certain points of entry, scorpion or earthworm are interdicted. You could make a strenuous argument, I think, to say that there's no dietary reason for a human being to consume huanglian, for example. Right? The fact is that we use these substances as medicines, and by leaving them in a food category, and by our sort of assuming that that category protects us, we're maybe making a mistake. And the other thing is this: our ability, all our clinical practice now, because very few people drop ship or send out to pharmacies or dispensaries for their product preparation for everything that they do, right? But some people do that, but many of us don't. That ability, our legal ability to do that, is simply a published choice on the part of the FDA, right? It's a choice. They can change their mind about that at any time. So
we're on sort of thin ice.
We're on exceptionally thin ice, and we, I would say leadership in our professional community and in the product community, certainly aware of this. There are conversations about what to do, but the bottom line is that we're in a reasonably good situation, but it's a little false because, quite honestly, the use of many of our products is not strictly what you would consider a food use. We have the ability to supply these products and use them in different ways through enforcement discretion. But both of these are situations that we're in due, quite frankly, to the generosity and open-mindedness of the FDA. I want to emphasize that FDA is absolutely not the enemy in this process. And in fact, one of the things that I haven't spoken to much is that the good manufacturing practice that FDA regulated and described, that's incredibly important to our industry because many of us use prepared medicines, we use granule products, we use things that appear in bottles and bags and with labels saying what they are. But if you look at a jar of granules, we have no idea what's in there.
Right. And we want to know that the company that we're buying it from has everybody's best interest in mind.
Absolutely. So FDA, these regulations are incredibly valuable to us, and they're important to the public. They're important to the practitioner. So I just want to underscore the issue historically with the FDA was its initial resistance to Deshay. I think it's moved on past that, and quite frankly, the enforcement discretion of 2008, or rather 2009, that's a huge contribution to our community. But the fact of the matter is, and all these wonderful things within Deshay, the fact of the matter is we are essentially practicing Chinese medicine on the basis of a category that isn't really right for it, and a regulatory gift from FDA, but not on the basis of any legal status or protection in a national framework.
So when you say gift, could you be a little more specific what that gift is?
Well, the gift is the enforcement discretion. In other words, because here's the thing: our industry, a colleague of mine, Jason Wright, and I did an analysis of the good manufacturing practices a few years ago for the Council of Colleges of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, CCAOM. It was operationally impossible, even for a college, to conform to the good manufacturing practices. in their dispensary, right? Let alone
And those good manufacturing practices included keeping the samples and
all the
all
other
that we talked
tracking
about
and so
earlier.
forth. I mean, there are a lot of these
Mhm.
things that are low hanging fruit. They're things that people can do, but the bottom line was to be compliant with what we call the current good manufacturing practices, the CGMPs, um, was an economic impossibility for any acupuncture school, let alone an individual practitioner.
Oh yeah, the overhead alone would kill you.
Yeah. Oh, operationally catastrophic. So when FDA published this and said, here's how we're going to proceed and it was respectful and supportive. It said, based on your education, based on your
Hmm.
training, based on our expectation that you're dealing with an individual patient and you're making things for them,
Right.
right? You're not making, like 1,000 bottles of Uncle Kevin's magical healing elixir and saying that's the enforcement discretion.
Hmm.
I can't do that.
Hmm.
But I can put those 2 herbs in a bag and give it to my patient,
Yep. Okay. So we've got that. We got that going for us.
which is good. Could be worse.
Uh, I think it lets all of us be in business right now. Those of us that are doing herbal medicine.
Absolutely. That's key. I think the thing that I worry about is simply that it lets all of us be in business right now, and that's what we love and that's what we want to do. And we kind of forget that we are here thanks really to FDA's interpretation.
In a moment, I want to get into some things that we can do to help make sure that we sort of get to keep our scope of practices this way. But there's a few other things I wanted to
Absolutely.
run by you before we get there. Okay, you mentioned losing the battle for Mahuang, and I'm curious to know more about that because it seems like Mahuang is available. It's not like it's completely unavailable. How did we lose that battle?
You make a good point. And Mahuang is available. And it is available in the following senses. It can be well. Let me actually let me give you just one piece of background. FDA regulates commerce that crosses our borders, that is, things coming into our country, and commerce that goes between states.
Mm-hmm.
And does not have authority over activities within a state unless that activity crosses a border to another state, right? Now, obviously, everybody works with FDA. States have policies that mirror FDA. Lots of so that operationally, that's not really an important distinction. But FDA's prohibition on Mahuang specifically targeted dietary supplements. They cannot contain Mahuang. Nor can they contain ephedrine extracts or things of that sort. And FDA has the complete ability to interdict imported mahuang that has the destination of a dietary supplement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You could import it for other purposes. Um, I used to joke years ago about people. Well, shouldn't make a border joke, but I don't think we've reached the point where people are throwing bales of mahuang over the border fence, but you know that is in a sense a place that you could envision. There are mahuang growers in the U.S. There are routes of import that are legal, but we lost mahuang to dietary supplements. So I can't buy, for instance, a granular product of, say, mahuang tongue, right, or gugan tongue. That can't be imported in that form because those are all labeled and shipped as dietary supplements.
And it contains Mahuang, which at this point
Cannot be.
is on the no-fly zone.
Yep, exactly. So you're correct. I mean, almost every practitioner I know that prescribes in a Shanghan vein or wishes to manage patients, lots of good clinical uses for ephedra, typically will have access to those materials. The enforcement discretion makes that possible. There's some state laws that make it possible. But in terms of the product category, ephedra, mahuang left the world of dietary supplements. And that underlies this issue. Any herb that we use, I don't know if you remember this, but after ephedra went off the market, a lot of the diet companies latched on to bitter orange because it contains synephrine. And synephrine is a chemical cousin of ephedrine. It doesn't have the same precise effect. Its risk profile is different. To get it to act in the human system like ephedrine, you have to move to dose levels that are potentially dangerous. It's a super widely distributed, benign item in almost every type of citrus. Right? If you're having marmalade on your toast, you're having synephrine. But there was a moment where the enthusiasm of the diet supplement industry caused a lot of people in our field to go, oh my goodness, are we going to lose bitter orange because of this process?
Right.
So we need the fact that we live in the world of food and we practice as a gift of the FDA is actually something we should be quite cognizant of.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of a privilege in a sense that we get to do this. It's also the thing that is a potential hazard, because if you've got a company and their main business is to create a product that they're going to put not a drug claim on, but they're going to use the proper words in the proper way to suggest to people that you're going to, lose weight or stop smoking or get smarter. I mean, whatever it is that they're making, but they're looking to make a product. That's their main thing. And they're not thinking about it like we do, that we're going to use these substances sort of in a case by case for a certain person, but rather we're going to use it because we're going to get this biological effect. And if things go south, we also get the fallout from that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, it's funny. Last weekend, I did a presentation for a meeting of emergency medical service personnel, and it was on herbs that you might encounter when you did a run or a call, things that, can produce an acute catastrophic effect. And I spent some time just looking at what was new in the world. And
yeah, what's on that list?
Let's see what's on that list particularly. Well, you'll get angry mail, but if I say that kratom, for instance, the Southeast Asian plant which contains a specific opioid analog, there's a lot to discuss about that. But there are kratom products that are now juiced with available pharmaceuticals that are not scheduled. And people aren't really aware. If you buy something green and powdery, you think you're getting a plant, right?
Right. Yeah. Oh, of course. Right. And so often people go, well, it's just a plant. How could that be dangerous?
Exactly. And so there's that. There's a very interesting herb, yohimbe, which is an African in origin. There's also a pharmaceutical, it's alkaloid extract called yohimbine. Yohimbine is actually a legal pharmaceutical. Many manufacturers kind of duck a little bit and tuck in extra alkaloidal extract into these products,
which boosts up their potency.
Well, because the truth of the matter is, if you have a product, you'd like to sell more of it,
right? And you want people to feel an effect from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why the thing now with the diet supplements. I mean, synephrine's a thing, but caffeine is still the big win. Lots and lots of caffeine.
Well, I'm sitting here with a cup of it right now.
Yeah, me too. I can't possibly say a bad thing about caffeine, but I would say that what consumers aren't always aware of is if I put in yerba mate and guarana and green coffee beans and green tea extract, I have just loaded my product with caffeine.
Right.
Right.
Could we come back to this kratom thing for just a moment? I've heard a little bit about this.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, every time I come across it, there's something about it that just feels sketchy to me. I'm very uninformed on it. I'd love to get your hit.
So I'm actually comparatively uninformed too, because in my experience, saying anything really definitive about any plant usually takes me somewhere on the order of, I don't know, takes me a significant amount of time. I would say conservatively between 6 and 10 hours of a deep dive, and I'm not always convinced. The thing with kratom, and I should say, full disclosure, my son was once involved with an internet company that actually sold the product, but I don't think he'd necessarily agree with what I'm going to say. The product itself, when it's a viably harvested, ethically delivered product, seems safe to me, based on what I've read. Problems emerge, as they so often do, when people use amounts beyond what they should use, combine it with other substances, or purchase products that have been enhanced by other supplements or other pharmaceuticals. And the problem with the traffic on the internet, as we all know, is that it's virtually limitless what can be available for sale. And just because it's available for sale doesn't mean it's a good idea to buy it, or that it's even necessarily legal. One of the things that surprised me when I was preparing the talk were the products that seemed to be substantially illegal and yet in the marketplace, and that FDA would theoretically or regulatorily have the ability to go after. But I think it's limitless.
Imagine this. A patient walks into your clinic. They're carrying more than the pain in their body. There's a story there. A history woven with the stress of long days, the ache of things unsaid, and the quiet longing for something to shift. You listen, not just with your ears, but with your hands, your intuition, your heart. It's not just about needles or a formula. It's about connection. Understanding the threads that tie us together, mind, body, and spirit. That is where golden flower Chinese herbs comes in. Rooted in tradition and crafted with care, their formulas are more than herbs. They're a bridge between ancient wisdom and modern practice. Every bottle, a quiet partner in your work, helping you to meet your patients where they are. Because healing isn't just about treating symptoms. It's about creating trust, cultivating belonging, and helping someone feel truly seen. Golden Flower Chinese Herbs, your partner in practice and connection, where tradition meets care. Yeah, okay. Let's get back to some things that we can sensibly do to protect our current ability to use herbs.
Well, I could make a list, and my first one would be, by all means, become a member of your state or national professional association and contribute money and be aware of legislative and political issues, because at the end of the day, that's the feature of living in a democracy. So that for sure I think is important. The second is to become somewhat educated about the issues, and I'm going to chop that into chunks. Be sure that you're practicing within your training, right? Which doesn't mean that you can't grow, but it means that if you are unfamiliar with how to use an herb or a supplement or a substance, or you're unaware of prescribing practices or treatment methods, you ought to always strengthen your training. I'm a big fan, for instance, of the NCCAOM herbal certification. I think that's a kind of baseline standard for our community. I think that says something to patients and it says something to practitioners.
Right. So just because you're a licensed acupuncturist and I'm using air quotes here, herbs falls under the scope of practice of an licensed acupuncturist, you maybe want to think twice about using those herbs if you don't really know what you're doing.
No, I mean, as a professional, professionals by definition are meant to have an area of expertise and to constantly develop and build and know when they know and when they don't know.
Mm-hmm.
When they don't know is when they learn or they refer.
Mm-hmm.
And you're absolutely right. We just passed a landmark piece of legislation in New York back in 2016, I believe, putting herbal medicine or the use of supplements and natural products in our scope. We unfortunately did not succeed in getting an educational or examination requirement attached to that. And I actually had an acupuncturist say to me, well, I don't need to be trained in herbs because they're now in my scope.
Oh, my goodness gracious sakes alive. That is terrifying to me.
Yes, did not really warm my heart, I have to say. As I've gotten older, I try not to just scream when people say stuff. But yeah, that was pretty nuts.
Yeah. Well, but this kind of thing is a little bit frightening because we operate in the way that we do because the FDA seems pretty well reassured that we're policing ourselves, we know what we're doing, and we can be trustworthy and reliable in knowing when we can move forward and when we should refer.
And I think that's realistic. I spend a lot of time, and I just did another deep dive on this because I'm doing a presentation for some folks. I spend a lot of time looking at herb-drug interaction information, herbal toxicity information, and it's remarkable how little evidence there is of significant risk associated with Chinese herbal medicine if you leave aside Guangfangji and ephedra, which, quite frankly, the risk exposure did not come from our community, but that's a story for another day. But if you look at that, we're fairly safe. And if people are practicing, if they're using things as they've been trained to use them and they understand what they're using, I actually am very confident that our risk profile is fairly low, based on the literature. But public perception is a different matter. Medical perception is a different matter. You can see very uninformed articles and policy statements being written, and boy, go on the the interwebs, as it were, and you can see some stuff that would cause concern.
I take to heart as well your thoughts about joining your state organization, supporting your state organization, whether we like politics or not, whether we like legislation or not. This is the world that we live in. And it's really nice having our practices and being able to live the life that we want to live, often a little bit on the edge of, conventional society. And at the same time, we need people that are looking out for our well-being, right? The whole dry needling thing is another one of those where why would you want to support your state organization? Because they're the ones that are looking out for this stuff. So we don't have to spend all of our days worrying about it. We can just treat our patients and get on with things.
I think that's absolutely true. And I mentioned that I gave you a couple of publications and things for your website. There are a couple of useful articles that I did with Jason Wright. They're a little aged, but I think they're interesting, and we're starting to see some publication and some communication about, what I would call simple steps that people can take in their practices to safeguard patients. I mean, if I were going to mention a few, I would mention things like,
yeah, give us a few off the top.
So, if you're giving herbs or supplements to a patient, always take a medication history. The two things that I advise people about the most in terms of major pharmaceutical interactor is warfarin. The most risky herbal supplement from an interaction point of view is St. John's wort. And the clinical conditions that I advise practitioners to always watch very carefully are people that are medicated with lithium or who are trying to manage their blood sugar. These are places where accidents can happen if we're not careful. This is too much detail, but there are certainly ways to search the literature to avoid herb-drug interactions. But medication history, understanding the products that you're using, getting them from reputable suppliers, knowing your supply chain is key, because there are still counterfeit prepared medicines. There are companies that don't necessarily closely adhere to the CGMPs and don't necessarily provide practitioners with information about that. So I would say those would be the simple ones. And keep good records. What did you give your patients? Where did you get your products?
These are things we probably should be doing anyway, right?
Yeah, I would think. This is low-hanging fruit. This is stuff that's pretty much within everybody's capacity. And quite honest. Oh, and the other thing is this. Listen to patients when they have problems with your products.
Of course.
Keep lines of communication open. I'll tell you here, because I can't name the company, but as you're probably aware, there's a service now called MedWatch that FDA uses that allows pretty much anybody to report a adverse reaction with an herb or a supplement.
Actually, I'm not familiar with that. Please tell us about it.
Okay, well, this was a standard for pharmaceuticals. It got expanded to supplements. If you just Google MedWatch or type in "I want to report a supplement adverse effect," you'll pretty much be driven straight to reporting forms. And those can go in a variety of ways. Ideally, if your patient has, say, an upset stomach after taking your formula, you hope they're going to call you, right? Because maybe you can figure out what happened. But let's say they had an upset stomach after taking the supplement you gave them. You still hope they're going to call you, but maybe you think about that and you think, wow, that's not a side effect. That's not an anticipated effect. That's not something that I knew could happen. Then you might like to call the manufacturer.
Report it yourself.
Yeah, or you might invite the patient to, but very often you might want to do that. And manufacturers under Dietary, another great thing about Dietary, are supposed to do record keeping around this and reporting. And one of the things people don't understand about adverse event reporting is, theoretically, if I take your herbal product and fall down the stairs, that can be an associated event. I mean, when we were dealing with the Mahuang, the ephedra reporting, there were people in car accidents who had taken ephedra. Those in the end get winnowed out. They're not, but you cast a broad net when you do adverse event reporting. But that data is actually good for us. Sometimes people think, oh, I'm going to get into trouble, or I'm going to get someone into trouble. But what we see from the data that's been collected so far is herbal supplements are actually very safe. And we wouldn't know that without the kind of data that is getting collected.
It's good news. That's helpful to know.
I haven't reviewed it in a while, so I am speaking from memory, which for me is sometimes a tricky thing. But few, if any, deaths, serious adverse events, requiring hospitalization, things like that, not present. And again, with things that our clinical community provides to patients and things that are used arising out of our interactions, just not on the radar.
Yeah, I mean, I would think unless you're using a lot of futsa, I mean, there's certain herbs we know. If you've been trained in herbal medicine, there are certain herbs you want to be careful with it, and you want to monitor your patients and be on the safe side. It's not that dangerous if you know what you're doing.
Foods is actually, I tend to think of it as very safe if used appropriately, because everything we use is processed. So the aconitine alkaloids that are risky are actually converted to aconine alkaloids, which are not risky. But yes, good sense. I mean, why we're trained in what we do.
Right. And why we operate at, in the way that we do with the FDA, because we do have the training and we've demonstrated that. And so we get to do what we do
which is great. And my only comment is until the FDA changes its mind.
until they change their mind. So anything else? It's getting close. We're going to have to wind this thing down. Oh man, we could go for a while. Anything else that we should be attentive to?
I think we should be aware, and I'm talking more about this at Shenong, but I'll just say this briefly. We should be aware that over I would say the last decade, maybe a little longer, but say the last 14 years or so, there have been a series of efforts, decade's about right actually, to sort of figure out how we're going to solve this problem. There's been an effort that still exists, but it's not operationalized, called the Traditional Medicines Congress, that did a lot of work in 2008 to try to create a regulatory framework that would protect Chinese herbal medicine people, herbalists, naturopaths, Ayurvedic practitioners, the whole community of natural products clinicians. That just became more than any of us could sustain. It was a good effort. Its work product is still out there. We should be aware that there's some efforts on the part of national professional associations to support some baseline training standards, things that everybody can do to be safe. But really, what we need to be thinking about is how we can have national legislative protection for our clinical practice. Because look, FDA is great. They've been very supportive of us. They protect the public. They protect the public health. But it's not a good idea to have your entire professional practice dependent on the interpretation and generosity of a single federal agency.
I think with anything, you want to feel like you're on solid ground. We operate at the discretion of the FDA, and as long as things are going fine, good for us. But it could only maybe take one really big adverse event, for the thing to go up in flames.
I'm not sure that it would, because FDA is a smart agency about clinical practice.
Mm.
And I think that, if you observe the available data, we have the occasional, I don't want to even call them bad actors. I would say we have the occasional enthusiastic clinician or company that kind of pushes the boundaries. And FDA has, clarified what the boundaries are. But mostly our professional community is interested in taking care of patients, and protecting their interests is a big thing. I do think if I were going to beg people to do any one thing, I would say join state and national associations, be patient with politics. Because none of this stuff, I mean, our law in New York, which we're all very happy about, that took us over a decade of the most tedious, unpleasant, time consuming political work. It just takes time, and it takes money and patience.
Kevin, that's such a good point. Patience with politics. We live in a world where things are so instant, and we expect our quick hit of dopamine about, whatever it is that we're looking for. And we want things done immediately. And yeah, political processes, oh my God, like you said, they grind on for decades. I'm curious, how do you keep that long term vision as you're grinding up against the wheels of politics? How do you keep it together and keep motivated and keep moving forward?
Well, I mean, I would have to say that there definitely been periods where I haven't. I've just unplugged myself and said, like, I need to not actually even think about this anymore. I think some of it's dispositional. I mean, if you have a problem solving disposition, then the presence of the problem is a motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Working with people, with colleagues. I mean, I've always been privileged to work with people that I really value, and I've never seen anything that isn't a terrific group effort. So people will step in, people will step up, people will solve problems. a little bit like waves rising and falling. And that's why I'm saying being patient. Ideally, you can make a contribution for a period and move it on. Most of the problems in our community, I think, generally occur when people get impatient or angry with each other, or it's very easy to fall into the tendency to sort of blame rather than recognize that there are different perspectives. And it's quite frankly harder to do things that are constructive than things that are destructive. So try to return repetitively to our better intentions, I think, is what you do. I mean, I don't have any good pictures. I mean, I got involved in this issue, particularly when I lived and practiced on Long Island in New York, and a local, it was actually a county legislative body, decided they were going to make the possession of mahuang a felony before any other legal thing had occurred nationally or statewide. And I was frustrated by that because I didn't want to go to jail and I didn't want to be fined and I wanted to use mahuang. And that was about a year-long battle, political, public relations, and otherwise. We won for that moment before other things happened. So I think you have to sort of have a sense that there's a personal impact. And this stuff with FDA is so distant from our day-to-day experience. Does that make sense? That maybe it doesn't motivate us.
Yeah. Oh, no. It's so distant. I know that I never think about it. And I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you. I feel a little more informed about the situation. I've got a little better understanding of what the FDA is doing with Deshaun and how that affects us. And I am especially appreciative of what you said just a few moments ago, that the presence of the problem is the motivation. That, I could see taking on something that may take decades to solve, just continually returning to, there's this thing here and it needs some work. So thank you very much for that.
Exactly. Thank you so much for having me. This was fun to talk about something in a little detail.
I hope you all found that interesting and helpful to learn more about the regulatory situation and background concerning the herbs that we use in our practices every day. This is the first in a number of interviews that will be going up in the next day or two, all from the Shandong Society Conference. So stay tuned. I got more good stuff coming up for you here over the weekend. Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.